Okay, welcome everybody to the last session of this conference. And once we got the slides up, Arnaud, Mehl from the ECB will talk about seizing central bank assets. Microphone is on. So you have 20 minutes, and then we will have 10 minutes of discussion and then 10 minutes of Q&A.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so thanks a lot for having me here at the last session. I see that everybody is very fresh and energetic. The paper is about seizing central bank assets. It's joint work, which we've done over the past month with a few ECB colleagues. And given the topics, I mean, I have to emphasize that these views are ours and not necessarily those of the ECB.
Arnaud, could you sit down, please, so that you're perfect in the camera spotlight for the transmission?
Okay.
Thanks so much.
So it's like Hollywood, no?
Yes, exactly like Hollywood.
Very good. Okay, better like this. Anyway, so, right. So the paper's motivation comes from the fact that when Russia invaded Ukraine, I guess many people were surprised or didn't expect it. And what was perhaps even more unexpected was the response of the West, in the sense that an enormous batch of sanctions against Russia was adopted. And within that batch, one measure attracted a lot of attention and came largely as unexpected. It was the fact that the G7 and the EU decided to freeze Russia's central bank assets. And that was a lot of money. Russia holds about $600 billion worth of dollar reserves. And out of that amount, half of it was frozen, immobilized, blocked. So that's $300 billion worth of dollar reserves. Now, we are 3 years almost into the war. And as part of that, a number of people have discussed whether it would be opportune to go beyond the freezing of Russia's reserves and to actually seize them, take them, to finance the reconstruction of Ukraine and also its defense. So you had a really big discussion in the media, in some policy circles, among a prominent economist, with one camp proposing that this would be actually a really good idea for economic reasons, with no potential legal obstacles, and others defending the opposing view, saying that it would be illegal and that this would have important economic consequences. Now, we got interested into that question, and we wanted to understand what would be the effects of a seizure, a change in property, of central bank assets, in particular in the case of Russia. And one obstacle that we face in trying and understand this was that, first of all, the evidentiary evidence, or let's say the factual basis on which you could form an opinion was relatively limited. People were always mentioning a few examples, Iraq, Afghanistan, sometimes even France and Poland, as part of good examples that could be motivated to try and understand the implication of what could be done for Russia and Ukraine. But it was not very much. And second, there was a clear lack of conceptual framework to understand these questions beyond the legality, also from an economic perspective. So what we try and do in this paper is to put the current discussions in a broader perspective and unearth, that is, bring to life the long history of sanctions on central bank assets, which has been hitherto largely forgotten. And we try to propose a first step towards analyzing the global economic and financial impacts of sanctions on central bank assets, both freezes, what's being done now, and a seizure, through the lens of an international macro model. We have three contributions in the paper. So first of all, I mean, that's essentially half of the paper, and I would say perhaps the most innovative. We compile a new database on freezes and seizures of central bank assets over a century of data, which we use to compare that past evidence with discussions on today's Russia. And the key result here is to show that the scale of the freeze on central bank of Russia's assets is extremely large, has been rarely seen in history, and that there is absolutely no historical precedence which is comparable in the past for a potential seizure of Russia's asset, at odds with what has been ascertained in some earlier discussions. The second contribution which we make in the paper is to develop a new, what do you say, a theoretical framework to understand the global impact of sanctions on central bank assets, which we try to use to understand the underlying mechanisms. And one thing which we show with that model is that under certain calibration of the parameters, the seizing of a central bank asset can backfire on the country which imposes the sanctions in general equilibrium. And I'll try to explain why this is the case. All right, and we also provide a calibration for the case of today's Russia, where under central parameterization, indeed you have a cost, quite a cost, for the country which imposes the sanction, where the sanction backfiring in general equilibrium to the author of the sanction. Okay, right. So in the rest of the time that I have, I won't be able to go through all the paper, but what I do is I will try to give you a feeling of the new data that we compiled in that project, and I'll try also to give you a flavor of what the model says on a particular case of sanction on central bank assets, which would be a seizure of US of bonds. So starting with the data. The paper is very heavy on the data. It was perhaps the most important or the biggest effort which we did in that project. We essentially identify all possible cases which we could dig out of sanction on central bank assets using whatever it takes. So all possible sources of information on which we could put our hands on. And in doing that, we focus on the past century. And remember that in this intense debate that there has been on whether to seize Russia's central bank reserves, people have always come up with 3, 4, or 5 maximum historical alleged precedents. What we found is more than 100. And so using that evidence, we collected systematically important features of the sanctions taken on central bank assets, including the type, the country targeted, the legal basis, the beneficiaries, the duration. I mean, all sorts of things which you want to know if you want to characterize the measures that have been taken. And to give you really like a flavor of the richness of the data, this is an oversimplification of what we can actually show. That's a map of the world since 1950, where you can see the countries which essentially faced sanctions on central bank assets, be they freezes or actual seizures. Russia is the red one, and on the map you will recognize countries which are quite familiar. So for instance, I see Iran on the map, about which we talk a lot today. I see Afghanistan, the Taliban regime. I see Venezuela's Maduro's Venezuela, sorry, which is also there. I see North Korea, and so on and so forth. But we have that, in fact, for all countries since the First World War, and very granular data on each of those cases. One thing which we can do with the data is, of course, to shed some light on how large were the measures which were taken against Russia's central bank. So here again, if you look at the chart on the left-hand side, Russia is the red bar, and that bar is essentially the share of Russia's reserve in global foreign reserves. Russia was not the most, or let's say the largest case in history, which has faced sanctions on its central bank's assets. In fact, it's Iran in 1979, after the fall of the Shah's regime and the replacement of that regime by the Mullah regime. That was the biggest case. And there was also like a big cluster of cases around the Second World War, where essentially the US was seizing the gold reserves of the countries which were invaded by Nazi Germany in an attempt to prevent Nazi Germany to put its hand on those reserves to finance this war. All right, so Russia is not the biggest, but it's actually a very big case, and one of the second biggest case in history, but it's also very unique in the sense that despite what has been asserted, if you start to really dig and understand what those cases were, here I'm going to show a summary of this, you will find no relevant historical precedent for what has been envisaged in the case of Russia. So start from the right-hand side panel, which splits the measures on central bank assets between freezes and seizures So remember, freezes are temporary measures. Seizures are permanent measures, where you actually really take forever the assets of the central bank. Essentially, freezes are twice as more frequent than seizures. But what's particular about seizures on the chart on the top right is that they usually happen, when there is a war or after the end of a war. Essentially, what happens is that you can have some countries at war with each other may seize the reserve of the opponent, and in particular, when there is a settlement of a war, this can be part of the war reparations. But what the chart on the right, in the bottom row, makes clear is that there has been no case of seizure ever in history of two countries which are not at war with each other for the benefit of a third party. So we never had in history the case where, let's say, one country like the EU or the G7 would seize the country of of another country with which it is not at war, like Russia, for the benefit of a third country, which would be Ukraine. Now, this is not of importance only for economic historians or historians in general. It's important for legal experts, which rely a lot to understand what the legal implications or what legal basis is on precedents. So the data that we have can actually substantiate the fact that there is no relevant historical precedent or a comparable historical precedent for today's Russia, for a possible seizure of today's Russia's reserve. All right. One thing which is also interesting about in history is that when you turn to history and try to understand and read about those things, you often recognize elements in the debates that occurred back in the past, even long ago, and recognize some elements that you could hear still today. So for instance, this person, Richard Newcomb, was the director of the OFAC, which is the office in the US in charge of managing assets frozen by the US abroad. And this director was testifying to US Congress and saying, in the case of a potential confiscation of Vietnam's reserves, Vietnam had seen its reserve frozen by the US by the time of the Vietnam War. And the question arose as to whether the US should go further to indemnify some of the victims of the conflict. So he was essentially saying that if the US were to do this, this would damage the reputation of the United States as a safe location for the investment of foreign capital. So already back then, there was this awareness that going one step beyond from freezing towards seizing could have implication for, let's say, the perception of the US as a financial center. If you go back again further back in history, and this is now an example from the Second World War, there was also the perception that if the US were to seize, in that time, the dollar reserves of countries invaded by Nazi Germany, there could be some risk of rebalancing of portfolios away from the dollar towards the alternative asset back then, which was gold. Interestingly, in the discussions about the seizing of Russia's reserve today, you also have evidence that some countries could be concerned and shift also into gold. But in any case, that concern was already there, and as usual in history, you see that it doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but there is certainly some rhyming going on. All right, so having established the historical factual basis of the debate, the second part of the paper tries to go beyond and try to understand the implication of crossing that Rubicon. What if the West were to seize the reserves of the Central Bank of Russia? What would be the macro implications of this? So to shed some preliminary light on that question, what we do is to take an off-the-shelf, unestablished international macro model with three countries, where we have, in fact, a block which is the US, essentially, or you can think of it as the West. Another block which is the targeted country by the sanction, which would be Russia. And then a third block which is the rest of the world. Now, from that standard model, what we do is to add a couple of ingredients. One is a convenience lien in the international traded assets, so household, or in the utility function of households. They derive utility from holding the safe assets in the model, which are US bonds, which is a standard way of modeling a convenience yield. So they like US bond over and beyond the pecuniary benefit that you can derive from it. The second tweak, which we put in the model, is active management by the central bank of its reserves. So obviously we have a Taylor rule in the model that determines money supply, but on top of that we had the fact that the central bank will try to optimize the composition of its reserve, which comprise two assets. One is gold, which is G, and the other are US bonds, which is B, subject to CES preferences, and it will do so by trying to match assets and liabilities on its balance sheet, so essentially matching the money supply with the reserve assets, so subject to these CES preferences. So these are the two tweaks which we add to the model. The rest is extremely standard. Now, two things which are important. One is that in each period, the supply of gold is fixed, which means that the price of gold will clear the market. And the quantity of US bonds available in the economy is pinned down by the government budget constraint of the US. And also, by the way, I should add that the profits of the central bank are given each period to the government. All right, so now, having that model in mind, the way we model the sanction is very simple. We have a shock to the law of motion of accumulation of gold, which is, I'm not exactly sure what Greek letter that is, but let's call it eta. And we do the same for bonds. We plug a shock in, and we distinguish seizure from freezes by imposing the fact that freezes will be temporary, they will last 40 periods. So it's a quarterly model, so 40 periods will be 10 years, and seizures will be forever. The money is gone forever. So in the case of freezing, it's gone for 10 years. In the case of seizure, it's gone forever. All right. Okay. So let me try to give you an intuition of the key mechanism that we have in the model, and hopefully to show you a couple of simulations. Now, the model is useful because it sheds light on essentially two channels through which sanctioned and central bank assets propagate through the economy. The first channel is very intuitive. If I take some bonds exogenous bonds from a central bank, the quantity of bonds that the central bank holds on the asset side will fall. And as a result of matching between assets and liabilities, the money supply issued by the central bank will tend to fall as well. So that's the first effect. A sanction on central bank assets is essentially like an adverse financial shocks that hit the central bank and the economy. But there are an opposing force that goes potentially into a different direction, which comes from the fact that given that the bonds are dollar denominated, when you take away dollar bonds on the central bank, on the asset side of the central bank, what you're essentially doing is you're restricting the supply of dollar assets in the economy, which means that you're making those dollar assets scarcer, and as a result of that, the currency of the economy hit by the sanction will tend to depreciate relative to the dollar. And given that the dollar will appreciate as a result, the value of those bonds, which are dollar denominating, will tend to increase, and the value of the gold, which the central bank holds, will also increase to the extent that it's dollar denominated. So you have this positive valuation effect on the asset side of the central bank, which will result into an increase of the money supply, which will be itself expansionary. So these two opposing forces will come into play. What's more is that given that the price of dollar bonds increases because they're scarcer, also the interest rate on those bonds will start to fall, which will also be expansionary. So you have these two forces that are at play. The first force is the adverse financial shock. The other force are the positive valuation effects on the asset side of the central bank's balance sheet, and also the depreciation of the local currency vis-à-vis the dollar, which will tend to boost exports. All right. Okay. So in the 1 minute that I have, I will present you a simulation which we do for the symmetric case. So everything is very simple in that simulation. All countries have equal size. The parameters are very standard values, and there is some degree of imperfect substitutability between bonds and gold on the assets of the balance sheet. So very quickly, the sanction, it's a seizure. Hits the target country, which is S. So think of it as Russia. That's the black line. Money supply decrease. As a result of the money supply increases, you have a tightening in monetary conditions. So interest rates in Russia, say, increase. The exchange rate of the targeted economy depreciates relative to dollar. And since the exchange rate of the targeted economy depreciates relative to dollar, you have higher inflation via higher pass-through, but also stronger exports. And as a result of the stronger exports, even an increase in output in the targeted economy. So you see that the adverse financial shock that comes from the sanction can be turned upside down by the other channel, which go via valuation effects on the central bank's value chain and also exports. Okay, in 1 minute, I skip the validation. Anyway, that's a very weak part of the paper, I'm sure. Nuno will have a lot of things to say. So we find some evidence that that the mechanism that we have in the model may have may capture some historical regularities in the data. We don't hit everything as we should, but there are nothing which is completely out of whack with what the model say, which give us some comfort to say that, okay, maybe it says something on the reality. We try to do a calibration for today's Russia, where we have more realistic output shares, more realistic composition of Russia's, of the target Russia's reserves, and when we try to estimate some of the key structural parameters in the model with moment matching. So I skip everything. So basically, even in this calibration version, some of the mechanism or the two mechanisms which we had still carry out. But there is one thing which is interesting, is that if you actually try to make the model even more realistic and restrict access of Russia to US bond market, as it is in practice, because the central bank of Russia is not allowed to actually transact in US bonds. So if you cut that source of demand for US bond, when you have a sanction on Russia's reserve, you will also have an increase in US interest rate, which can be potentially quite large. Because you're actually cutting some demand for those US bonds. Okay, I stop here. Conclusion, scale of Russia's freeze of standby is rarely seen in history, no comparable precedent. The sanctions can backfire in good general equilibrium, and this is an implication for policy because Seizures is not a marginal step, it's a big step, so we should be careful about today's situation. Thanks a lot, sorry for being too.
Thank you, Arnaud, for this very fast conclusion at the end. And we have 9 minutes for Nuno Coimbra from Banque de France with a discussion. We have to.
It's not on? Can you hear me now? Okay. And so I guess one important main new insight is that this exchange rate channel can lead to declines in consumption and output also in the sanctioning country. So I thought Arnaud would have focused more on this part of the discussion, which I think is interesting, but I actually didn't focus so much on the discussion. So we have seen sanctionings on Russia on exports, and this idea that non-sanctioned products tend to have some increases in countries that are adjacent. But I think importantly, we have talked a lot about trade sanctions during these 2 days, a bit about financial, but I think this is really maybe first order as well, because despite the fact that these measures were extremely large and comprehensive, and they included trade sanctions, but also on institutions and individuals, the sanctions on the central bank were extremely large. But it's also important to say that assets frozen included also private assets, not just central bank ones, but it makes sense to focus on the central bank sanctions because these were the majority of assets frozen by the US and their assets and their allies. So it's true also that it's been discussions in this G7 about seizing some of these frozen assets, as some of the discussions that Arnaud mentioned. And the EU is already using profits from funded assets, from frozen assets to fund Ukraine, which could be seen as well already as a form of seizure, because this should not be the case in a freeze. Okay, so what does the paper do? So first of all, I'm going to talk about the theory section, and then I'll come back to the empirical part. So it's a DSG model building on Ackermann et al. And it has 3 countries, so it adds an additional country. So there's the US, the sanctioned country, and the rest of the world. We have bonds and money in the utility functions, so that provides liquidity services. And then the central bank balance sheets have gold and bonds and US bonds as reserve assets, which are imperfect substitutes, as mentioned. So, right, this is the model will shed light on these 2 important channels that Arnaud just mentioned. The wealth channel, there's this direct impact of sanctions on the financial wealth of country S, right? So that's pretty straightforward. But then they have this real exchange channel where the dollar appreciates vis-a-vis the sanctioned country, but can actually depreciate relative to the rest of the world, which is, dampens the impact on the sanctioned country, but actually can backfire on the US. Okay. So on the empirical section, I think there's a huge contribution here of the new database on central bank sanctions, which have a lot of information on what they are. Type, target country, coalition, the legal basis for the sanction. I think there's a whole host of characteristics that can be useful, and they provide these descriptive statistics and show the used model to match certain regularities. Okay, so going back to the main mechanism of the model, it's going to, I think, focus on this central bank balance sheet constraint, where the real money holdings on the left-hand side have to be equal to some aggregator of gold and US bonds. And so a fall in the US bonds after sanctions, be either freeze or a seizure, is going to be a problem because it's costly to replace US bonds with gold, right? And so this leads to a monetary contraction in the sanctioned country. But on the other hand, this monetary contraction is going to lead to an increase in the interest rates. And that's going to lead to an immediate depreciation followed by appreciation. And this immediate depreciation actually helps dampen a bit the initial impact because it's going to raise the value of gold in domestic currency and it's going to raise the value of US dollar assets in domestic currency. Okay, so the central bank balance sheet equates this real money balance with this aggregator, but I think crucially there's, I think something I would like to see is that there's no money creation using domestic assets. And you could imagine that, and also it's also the case, that only money and US bonds provide liquidity service, but not domestic bonds. So I think a first question would be why not add a domestic asset to the balance sheet? We talked a bit already about this, but I think this would be quite first order because you can imagine that, okay, maybe it's very costly to replace with gold, but and I can replace it with just selling domestic assets and so I might be able to avoid this contraction, this monetary contraction through this. So it's not clear for now what is the real impact of this monetary contraction. I think also it's kind of said, okay, in a way it's bad, but it's also good because it generates depreciation. But it would be nice to decompose these two effects, right? So what's the real impact of this monetary contraction compared to before we consider the effects on the exchange rate, right? So I think having a stock of domestic assets might help reduce the monetary contraction. And that crucially could have a very different impact on the exchange rate depending on what asset you use to counterbalance the sanctions. And I think that could also have very different implications for the sanctioning country, right? So if this monetary contraction is going to be counterbalanced by, trying to buy more US assets, or if you're, or gold, if you're banned from buying new US assets, then that could spill over much less for the US if a lot of the action is coming from the domestic asset. Also, crucially, I think something that comes across in the discussion a lot is the position of the US dollar as dominant global currency. So we also, Arnaud also discussed a bit this with the news that he showed and the quotes. But in this case, the position of the US as a global currency is taken as given. And so the expectations of seizures do not depend on past seizures, which is something that has been commented as Arnaud showed. So this is extremely hard to incorporate in a full dynamic model. I guess I'm not asking that much of Arnaud, but I think there's things you could do, right? So for now, the exclusion from using US bonds as reserves is temporary, but you could imagine that basically the country either permanently, so just to find the other extreme case, and then you have a window of what could happen if the other country then it does not demand US bonds as much as before once the temporary exclusion goes away. So you could look at the permanent exclusion, or something like sanctions leading to the credibility of the US as a reserve currency, because the rest of the world also fears that sanctions, again, as an extreme case, but would give us some ballpark of what are the maximal consequences that could happen to US yields if the rest of the world also stops trusting the US to use the US bonds as a reserve. Okay, so I think especially to see the impact on US convenience yields in these new steady states would be quite interesting. Okay, so going back to the empirical sections, as Arnaud discussed a lot about the database, which I think is an extremely useful tool. And for now, they're just running this specification where you take the real exchange rate, gold prices, inflation, or output, and then you do a simple regression where you have sanctions, trade sanctions, and geopolitical risk. I think we've seen a lot. The database, like I mentioned, is very detailed, but the use for now seems very sparse. So I think much more could be done here, and I suggest, for example, given that the fact that at the moment shocks are not identified, we're just taking these sanctions as exogenous in a way. I think you could go more into the literature that has done sanctions after sovereign default, where they use mostly gravity equations, and also we've seen a lot of mentions of gravity equations in these 2 days, where you would look at things a bit more bilaterally, but you could control a lot more for a lot of these things, right? So there's a huge literature on this that I think you could just follow, and they've been looking at different types of sanctions, not financial ones, but you could. Secondly, I think it would be also interesting to see sanction as also endogenous variables, right? So of course there's a strong geopolitical element, but is there an economic one? Can we find something that predicts at least the timing and the predictability of sanctions, right? So again, I'm stretching a bit because I don't have access to the database to see how much you could do, but I would find it interesting to see if there is some predictability, or if it's just pure geopolitical and completely unrelated to economics. And finally, I think you can use the cross-section a lot more, right? So you can look at country types, which you have not done so far, sanctioning, or third party, type of sanction. You have all this information in your database, role of political and physical distance, right? You can imagine that the way allies are affected is different from maybe allies of your geopolitical rival. And things like this. So I think it's a great database, and I think that there's so much you can do that it doesn't fit simple slides. So I just give you generic bullet points, but specific things I think you can do many. Okay, so then I'm out of time. I have additional minor points that I will share with Arnaud. So just to conclude, I think it's a very nice paper, interesting and rich theoretical approach. It's very simple, but already gives you a lot of results. And I think there's so much to do with this framework, both with the empirical and the theoretical one. I'm looking forward to see the next iterations of the paper. So thank you.
Thank you so much to Nuno. I'm collecting questions, maybe short questions. One on the, yeah.
Hi, Joanna Bryson, Hertie School. I have a quick question that's not economic. It's more about your data set, that this uniqueness of it not being at war. Of course, Putin is saying that he's at war with NATO, and also there's some claims that he declared war in 2007, and that Georgia and Moldova and everything is all a part of this long action. So I'm just wondering if you could actually sort of turn this on its head and say, well, this is some evidence that they would be considering taking this. That, I mean, I don't know if you know this, Germany apparently suffered 130 billion euros of damage from cyber assaults in just last year from Russia and China. So we're talking about really, some people are saying that we are already in an active cyber war, including the US. So.
Maybe we collect the other two, yeah.
I just wanted to, I mean, you couldn't explain you don't have time to talk a lot about the empirical exercise, but I was wondering whether it's important to take defaults into account. If you want to look at I mean, it seems that what would matter is the net assets that are seized from the country. If these issues are accompanied by default, that seems like something relevant, and not just look at the gross amount of reserves that are seized. Thanks.
And final short question, then afterwards I would ask Arnaud to give a quick response to these questions.
Yeah, very interesting paper. I really want to read this. Just a couple of points. One is on the central bank balance sheet. I would echo Nuno's point. There's, you know, on the left-hand side of that balance sheet, it's got to be something else, that has to be made a little more elaborate, shall we say. The second point is the suggestion that other countries might divest themselves of U.S. securities and that this would have all sorts of consequences. I'm just curious to know, what would they hold instead? What assets are there out there that could be substituted in central bank portfolios for U.S. Treasury securities?
Okay, so I'm going to start with Richard with your two questions. So starting from the last, so indeed that's the main argument that proponents of that measure, Barry Akenrin has written an excellent piece on this, saying that if the West were to seize the central bank of Russia's reserve, the economic consequences and the risk of a shift of reserves away from the major reserve assets would be very limited, because there's just no credible alternative, right? So that, okay, so I speak in personal capacity here. So that's probably true in the short term, but 10, 15 years from now, it could be that other assets are developed. So Barry has papers also that show that it's not the RMB that gains importance in terms of reserve currency, but all the smaller currencies are gaining importance. First thing. Second, you do see some evidence that gold is increasingly demanded by some central banks with certain geopolitical characteristics. Of course, the quantity of gold is fixed, or let's say it does not just it's very sticky, but. Okay, all I'm saying is that the reputational damage could still be there, and it's not the best thing to do something which is potentially illegal to reestablish, to repair an illegality that's been committed in the first place, to reassure investors. So, but again, so I speak here in personal capacity. So your point that we should make the central bank balance sheet more elaborate is a very valid one. So that was one of the points that Nuno has made, to which I agree. So we will be working on this. Alberto's point that we should take into account default is very okay. So the short answer is yes, we should take that into account in the discussion. Your question on is there a war or not? So I will not say, I will not comment on that question. And on so Nuno, so I wanted to thank Nuno a lot for all his comments. So we already discussed everything, so he knows that I agree with everything that he has to say. And as it turns out, so you were kind enough to send us the slides early on, so I can tell you that the people back in Frankfurt are already working on the comment, and some of them are already addressed. It's good management. And And thank you for telling us that the full potential is yet to be unlocked. So I'm going to translate this. So when a central banker tells you that the full potential of something has yet to be unlocked, it means that you better do those changes because otherwise you're going to hit a wall. But okay, thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much to the presenter and the discussion. And now we have a talk on geoeconomic fragmentation and connected countries by Franziska Ohnsorge from the World Bank. And now we really have to stick to the timeline. Yeah, so we start now.
Okay, thank you. So let me start with 4 points. First, this paper is co-authored with Shekhar, Aiyar. Second, both of us, we're at the World Bank, the IMF, so the usual disclaimer applies. Third, I want to thank our discussant who's already prompted us to upload an improved version. And fourth, I want to thank all of you. You really win the prize for stamina. We win the prize for stamina. So far, in Africa they have this saying, when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. So far, all the sessions, almost all the papers I've seen, were about the elephants. Our paper is about the grass. It's deliberately about the 185, 186 other countries who are not the hegemons, and about their decision problem, the struggle they are facing. This is the question they are asking us. So they take as given geoeconomic fragmentation, then they ask, how vulnerable is my country, and how should I respond? Because they see what one of the US presidential nominees is saying about Vietnam, about Mexico, about China. And then they also see that the Biden administration's trade representative says exactly the same thing, just a bit more politely. So they're fully aware that there is a war situation in 2 big regions of the world, to put it like Narendra Modi. So they don't consider themselves, when they ask us these questions, how vulnerable am I to this war situation, and how should I respond? They don't consider themselves the passive conduit of Chinese FDI into exports to the US. They think of themselves as making an active decision problem. And they're balancing a new source of risk. So that brings to mind then, of course, the finance literature, where you have risk and return, and presumably in the end, the optimal policy has something to do with portfolio allocation. So our paper is an attempt to get at to answer these questions. Bottom line, to start right up front. So the first question we can answer: which countries are most vulnerable to geoeconomic fragmentation? It's emerging markets. And they're much more vulnerable on finance than on trade, and I'll show you why. The second question, the best policy response, we cannot yet answer, but we can answer what policy response they have actually taken already, ever since, well, compared to 2016, when these tensions really started rising. So in the process, we think that the contributions of our paper are 2. First, we formalize the notion of a geoeconomic connector from the perspective of a non-hegemon. So I'll talk about emerging markets now, but we have a database, and the paper is about advanced economies too. But it's all from the perspective of the non-hegemon. Yeah, the 185, 186 countries that are 80% of the world's population. And in the process, we prepared an extensive database that is actually full of publicly available data, so we could upload it on the Harvard database, all the bilateral links. And we deliberately don't discard any data in our exercises, and we use a consistent approach across the various types of economic links. Let me go a bit into it. I skipped this. So the database, this basically summarizes the database. We have data on exports, we have data on imports, we have some sectoral data, but it's really quite crude. We have data on FDI liabilities, portfolio investment liabilities, and liabilities to BIS reporting banks. Odds and ends and bits and pieces have been covered by other authors in various exercises. No one has put all of them together and rerun the same exercises consistently across all the questions and all the series. So we do that in the paper, but here I won't show you all of these results because I have 20 minutes. We use all these bilateral databases to create a measure of geoeconomic vulnerability and a measure of diversification, which we call connectedness. So the geoeconomic vulnerability, both measures are super simple. The geoeconomic vulnerability is simply the trade or liability weighted average of geopolitical distance. Now that measure was originally developed by the IMF in the April 2023 WEO for FDI, for confidential database of FDI. We use the same measure, we just apply it to all this publicly available data and all the types, different types of bilateral links a country can have. The second measure is to get at this idea of portfolio diversification, the geoeconomic connectedness, which is essentially the trade and liability-weighted standard deviation of geopolitical distance. And it's deliberately not at the sectoral level, it's at the country level, because this is what our counterparts' main concern is. So ministers of finance, Ministry of Economy, central banks, they're worried, they think of their decisions in terms of friend and foe, which is other countries. And then the second order problem is which industries are exposed. So it's deliberately a country-based measure. So vulnerability, so then we can come to answering the question, how vulnerable or which are the most vulnerable countries? How vulnerable am I? That depends on the geopolitical stance, and it depends on the economic ties, the bilateral ties. So for the geopolitical stance, we use this measure by Bailey, Wotan, and Shrevnev, 2017. They collapse all the UN votes into a single measure of ideal point of UN voting, basically. The US is always on the right, 2.5, and China is actually not to the left. It's just a little bit to the left from the center. Who's really on the left is Zimbabwe. So this measure here shows you the distribution of geopolitical stances. This chart on the left shows you the distribution of geopolitical stances for advanced economies, blue, and for emerging markets and developing economies, in red. You can see that they vote in lumps. They have different geopolitical stances. Advanced economies are somewhere between the emerging markets and the US, and the emerging markets and developing economies are really, they're all like China. Their geopolitical stance is pretty much like China, not far off. And then we have some examples in the chart on the right here, the main connector countries that people talk about, Mexico, Vietnam, maybe India. They're really voting like China. So all the emerging markets are pretty similar and to each other and to China, and pretty different from advanced economies and advanced economies. So that's one element of vulnerability, just how far you are. Our measure of geopolitical distance is simply the absolute difference between my country's geopolitical stance and that of every one of my trading partners. So if we then apply this geopolitical distance to these distances for all my trading partners and all my sources of foreign direct investment, portfolio investment, and liabilities to banks, and collapse this into a vulnerability index, we get the chart on the left. The average for the advanced economies is blue, the average for emerging markets is red, and the 90% confidence intervals are in whiskers here. You can see that whatever category you look at, emerging markets and developing economies are more vulnerable than advanced economies to geopolitical risks, to geoeconomic fragmentation. All the red bars are above the blue bars, and significantly. And that's because a lot of the world's imports and sources of FDI and finance in general are just in advanced economies. There is another different pattern that clearly jumps out here. Emerging markets and developing economies are obviously, clearly more vulnerable in their finance than in their trade. Because finance is essentially in New York and London. That's where it's coming from. So it's very clear in this data as well that they're more vulnerable in their finance and trade. Now, the other thing that's clear is to get at this idea of diversification, we have the chart on the right, which is our measure of geoeconomic connectedness. You can see again that emerging markets and developing economies are generally more connected than advanced economies. So they deal with a much wider range of markets and sources of finance, whatever kind of finance, whether it's FDI or portfolio or bank finance. And trade in general across advanced economies and emerging markets and developing economies also tends to be a much more integrated, much broader network. So they're much more, everyone is more diversified than in finance. Finance is really a very centralized system, especially for banks, and in part, that is because BIS reporting banks don't have many emerging markets. South Africa is really one of the few that's in our database. So when we talk about, when the policy discussion in the US talks about geoeconomic fragmentation, essentially in the context of Mexico and Vietnam. So in our paper, we use the advanced economy equivalents of Canada and Germany for institutional reasons. But here I want to show you what the differences between Mexico and Vietnam. Both of them have been labeled connectors, but they're very, very different. One is a vertical connector and one is a horizontal connector. So in the chart on the left, you see, for example, take Mexico. It receives FDI. I mean, the narrative is that it receives FDI from China and then produces exports for the US. Actually, there is so little FDI from China, you can't even see it in this chart. The narrative is true, but not for China to the US, it's true for the EU to the US. Mexico receives a large chunk of FDI from the EU and then produces exports, 80% for the US markets. So it is a conduit in a kind of supply chain way. So there's a supply chain in a vertical way, it's a connector. Very different from Vietnam. You see here the composition of FDI and export, FDI liabilities and export for Vietnam. Vietnam gets very little, but it gets some FDI from China, but really all from the EU, but a lot of FDI also from Japan, Korea. And that is converted into exports to everywhere. It's one of the most diversified exporters of all. It's really very broad-based. It's very different from Mexico, which essentially produces for the US market. So that's what we call a horizontal connector. Gets FDI from many sources and sends its exports wherever, many sources, truly diversified, the kind of thing that the Indias of the world aspire to. To translate this into our measures, we have the chart on the right. So start with FDI. Maybe you're surprised that the GOC, the connectedness measures, the blue bars in the chart on the right, are almost the same for Mexico and Vietnam, despite having very different compositions of the FDI. It turns out that Vietnam, the big bulk of Vietnam's FDI is from Japan and Korea, and those are very similar to the EU in their geopolitical stance. So actually, Vietnam is about as geopolitically connected, diversified, as Mexico is, simply because the EU doesn't differ that much from Japan and Korea in their voting. Vulnerability is also broadly similar on the FDI side. The big difference is in exports. Vietnam really exports everywhere. It really exports everywhere, so you get this very high GOC, this very high connectedness measure. They export as much to India and Thailand as they export to Germany and Netherlands. They're truly diversified. This is a horizontal connector. Whereas Mexico has a very low GOC, connectedness index, and a very high GOV, vulnerability, because it's quite far from the US in its political stance, geopolitical stance. Remember, it votes essentially with China. So this kind of describes the two measures of the two types of connectors. So how have countries actually behaved since 2016? And there's this vast variation across countries. Most of them actually haven't changed significantly, but a few have changed significantly. So those are the ones we focus on in this chart. Here we just count the number of emerging markets where there have been significant increases or decreases, either in vulnerability or in connectedness. So vulnerability in the left, connectedness on the right. Maybe we can just focus on the vulnerabilities in the left chart. Yes, that's why. For most, a much larger fraction of emerging markets and developing economies has seen significant declines in its trade, export vulnerabilities. And that's, well, we come to that in the next slide. But in finance, there's been most of emerging markets have seen, when they've seen any changes, they've been mostly to increase vulnerabilities. And both of them have become a bit more connected in the process. Now, why? So we have the two contributors to vulnerability and to connectedness, and one is the politics and the other one is the economics. So the chart on the left shows you politics, the chart on the right shows you the economics. Here on the left you see again the distribution of voting patterns for emerging markets. They've shifted to the US since 2016. So clearly countries are trying to align, most countries, the large majority of countries are trying to align themselves more in their voting with the US. That, of course, reduces the vulnerability. For some of them, that increase, depending on where they are, that increases or reduces their connectedness too. Then to get at the economic ties, how transactions have actually shifted, we recreate our vulnerability index by fixing the geopolitical stances at 2016. And then seeing how the index changed. So basically, any change here will be because of transactions changing, because we're holding fixed the geopolitical stance. And you can see that in exports, so on the trade side, it really was about transactions. Yes, there was also the political shifts, but transactions have they have shifted, whether it's deliberate or not, I don't know. But transactions have shifted towards friendlier countries. That's a big increase, especially in China, exports to China. But on finance, transactions have shifted to increase vulnerabilities, and that's not so much because they have shifted away from their friends, it's more that their big friend, has shifted away from them. China has had a big reduction in some of its FDI especially, to some of the emerging markets, and really large decreases. It's like their friend has left them. And that has left them more exposed in their composition to advanced economies and increased their vulnerability to geopolitical risk. Yes. So this was all yes or no. We're just counting countries. Have there been statistically significant increases or decreases? It doesn't get at the how much. This is what we try to get at here in this slide. It's a very simple correlation. No? Who has changed their vulnerability the most? Very simple. We run the change in the Geoeconomic Vulnerability Index since 2016 on the initial vulnerability index. And it's very obvious that no matter which dimension you look at, the countries that were most vulnerable initially were the ones that reduced their vulnerability the most, by far. And mostly that has been accompanied by a reduction in connectedness. So they've kind of shrunk the range of political views that they deal with, except in finance, portfolio finance and BIS reporting banks. And I think in BIS reporting banks is a reporting issue because we have so few emerging market banks in there. It's really just, Chinese banks don't report, and it's really just South Africa here. So I'm not sure what this is, I'm not surprised, it's not picking up much. Portfolio liabilities also, a lot of it comes from advanced economies, maybe emerging markets simply can't diversify. But it's very obvious that the most vulnerable countries were the ones that cut their vulnerabilities the most, and they seem to have done it by shrinking the range of countries they deal with, geopolitical views they deal with. So next step is obviously to answer that second question, which is what should countries do, not just what have they done. And for that, we're working with another co-author to put together a theoretical model that links GDP growth to geoeconomic connectedness and vulnerability. And then also another third step maybe, is to estimate empirically, does geoeconomic vulnerability and connectedness actually make a difference to the impact of geopolitical shocks? So that'll come in future. Let me conclude. Bottom line is, emerging markets are more vulnerable to geopolitical shocks, but they're also more geopolitically connected, in part because they just deal a lot more with China. So they're more vulnerable than advanced economies and more connected. For emerging markets and developing economies, not for advanced economies, but for emerging markets and developing economies, vulnerability is much larger in finance than in trade. And connectedness is also larger in trade than in finance. That's true for everyone. For emerging markets and developing economies, declines in geoeconomic vulnerabilities and exports were more common than increases, but increases in vulnerability of financial sort of inflows were more common than decreases. And the most vulnerable countries in 2016, initially most vulnerable, were the ones that reduced their vulnerabilities most and seem to have also shrunk the range of countries they deal with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franziska. And now we will have the discussion by Monika Kerekes from the BMWK. I'm missing the English abbreviation.
Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. I know that. So thank you for having me. I promise I'm going to be brief. And you can already see that, well, you can't see it here, but I only have a limited number of slides. So I very much enjoyed reading this paper, and therefore I'm also pleased to review it, because I think the question of connector countries is actually a very relevant one in the geoeconomics literature. The existence of connector countries determines, to a large extent, the costs of economic fragmentation. We've heard that this morning from Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas, who has already talked about connector countries. Those were mainly the results of the US-China trade war, and the analysis based on that. We also have the importance of non-aligned countries in the literature estimating the impacts of trade decoupling. There we see that the size of the welfare effects usually depends to what extent non-aligned countries can cushion the reduction of trade between opposing blocs, and in general the costs are more manageable. The more foregone trade between blocs can be absorbed by non-aligned countries. So in that sense we really need these connector countries, even though, I don't think there is a real definition of connector countries so far. Let's go to the main insights of the paper. Of course, the main insight, or the main contribution, to call it like that, is the new indicators that have been made available for vulnerability and connectedness. And what I also find very useful is this, the possibility to decompose changes into changes due to shifting transactions, that is active things countries are doing, and shifting geopolitical alignments. And as we've also seen, we have, as far as I'm aware, for the first time, very systematically derived facts over over the development of vulnerability and connectedness. We see how it developed over time between country groups. We can see the reason why, why the developments have occurred, and we also see correlates of connectedness in this paper, so it's all very useful. When I was reading the paper, I had 3 points that I'm going to take up in the discussion. The first one is connectedness versus connector countries. The second is export-based indicators versus import-based indicators. And of course, working at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs, I wanted to see what the data looks like for Germany. So let's look at connectedness versus connector countries. I was interested how the typical suspects named in the literature, namely Indonesia, Mexico, Morocco, Poland, and Vietnam, actually fare with regard to the connectedness indicator. Like, my gut feeling was, okay, if they are connector countries, they surely became more connected. And therefore, I was quite surprised when I saw these diagrams, because we see neither did those connector countries start in 2016 with a special level of initial connectedness, nor was a change really extraordinarily high. So more or less connectedness stayed the same. And one might argue that, I'm actually missing the point by looking at connectedness estimated based on total exports, so I should maybe look on FDI inflows, because we know from the literature it's often argued that China kind of indirectly exports to the United States because of FDIs. But when we look at that picture, there's also not much happening there. So I think that stresses several, several points. The type of connectedness we look at here is not equivalent to the connector countries that are named in the literature. And it also stresses the point that connector countries are indeed very different, and it's interesting to see what the differences are. And I don't find it that surprising that we don't see the typical suspects for connector countries as being connected in this, with this indicator, because the indicator has nothing specific about China, and the connector countries are usually, to some extent, defined with regard to China. Still, I think it might be useful if you just took up this point a bit more clearly in the paper, because I think it's a very relevant point to make clear that this connector country you are using is something different than the connector country most people start with. So next story. Next slide. Export-based versus import-based indicators. So what Franziska has not mentioned, she's also calculated everything, not only on export, on the basis of export, but also on the basis of imports. And for me, that was a bit odd, coming from an advanced economy. Like, the usual focus of the discussion is import dependency. So I wanted to see, does it make a difference whether we look at the import or the export side? And we see, when we look at vulnerability or changes thereof, which I think is, is relevant in, if you look at changes in vulnerability. Right, we see that the indicators based on exports and the indicators based on imports are very much correlated, so it probably doesn't change the story a lot, which one you use. And that's a bit different if you look at the indicators based on subgroups of trade. So in this diagram on the right-hand side, I've used the change in vulnerability based on exports versus imports of intermediate goods. There it makes a difference, the correlation is less pronounced. So my conclusion is that the choice can make a difference, and especially if you look at specific countries, it's worthwhile to look at both sides. It's also some kind of warning that maybe if you use a vulnerability index only based on exports, for some countries this might be different than if you use kind of an aggregate vulnerability index. To be fair, the paper discusses this issue in the appendix, in the footnotes. I lost track of that in between, but I think you should kind of put that into the paper. Okay, finally, the case of Germany. So I've looked how vulnerability and connectedness have developed. We see total vulnerability has increased. No, that's the level of vulnerability. We see the level of vulnerability in 2022, and we see that it actually makes a difference whether you look on imports or exports. When you look on imports, it's consumption goods that catch the eye. But you can also see that for capital goods, the vulnerability based on exports is higher. So that kind of also is important for us, that we should, whenever we talk about de-risking, it's important to look at both sides. So there is import de-risking that should be done, but it's also on the export side. And then I have looked how the vulnerability has changed from 2016 to 2022. Just note that this is in the time period mainly before de-risking became a political priority, so it's not entirely surprising that we see an increase in vulnerability during this time period. But once we use this very useful decomposition, we also see that much of the vulnerability is simply driven by the geopolitical stance and not by shifting transactions. And what I don't show here, because I only have the data for total imports and total exports, I've checked how vulnerability changed from 2022 to 2023, and that's indeed the first year where we see that vulnerability for Germany declined, not by much, but it did decline, so it's good to know that some kind of de-risking indeed started, and the small size of the decline is also in line with what company surveys say, that well, companies try to de-risk and to diversify, but actually once they start doing so, they find it hard to find alternative suppliers. So to sum up, the new indicators are a welcome addition, I think, to assess the geopolitical risks facing a country in the current geopolitical environment. I find the distinction between transaction-related changes and changes in geopolitical alignments very useful. And I would actually be excited to see one kind of research you mentioned in the paper, namely about optimal trading, the optimal choice of trading partners, because I think that could really give important policy hints for us. So I would like to encourage you doing that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to Monika, Kerekes, not only for this discussion and showing us the case for Germany, but also for hosting us here as a representative of the Federal Ministry. So thank you very much, and a big round of applause. And since we're running really short on time, we have time maybe for one short question if there's one in the room. Otherwise, as both Franziska and Shekhar are here, oh, there's one question here, sorry.
Yeah, I have a very interesting paper. So I wonder, what about the substitutability? So you might be seem very specialized, but you can easily substitute away, while others might be less, but they cannot substitute away from trading partners. Do you have a way to measure this elasticity of substitution that might be correlated with this vulnerability?
Okay, thank you. Great comments. Thank you very much. Yeah, what we realized is that the whole idea of people throw these connectors together, and they're really very different countries. They're totally different. What countries like India aspire to is the Vietnam. They're not aspiring to the Mexico. They want to have the choice. So if something goes wrong in one relationship, there is another relationship that they can use. That's why we focus on these horizontal connectors. Imports versus export, yeah, maybe we should break that out more. Others have told us to take it out, but it's true, it is important for advance. The funny thing is there's a divergence here. Advanced economies are interested in imports. Emerging markets are interested in the export markets, not losing their export markets. So it's really a different target group. I'm glad to see that the 2023 numbers make sense. And optimal choice of trading partners, hopefully we'll get there when we do our theoretical exercise. The substitution, I'm not sure how we would measure it. I have to think about it, whether there is a way of somehow finding some trade cost or something that gets at some of these gravity variables to see how easy it is to substitute one kind of trading partner with the other. We have to think about it. That's a good question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to all the presenters and discussions in the session, and thank you everybody for coming to the conference. I now ask you all to join the group in the other room to hear the final remarks of the conference by Moritz Schularik, and yeah, have a nice evening.